At 2200 hours on November 17, 1944, Sergeant Mel Grevich stood in a storage warehouse at Camp Tarawa, Hawaii, staring at a row of damaged aircraft waiting to be scrapped. The air was thick with the smell of oil and rust. At 26, with 18 brutal months in the Pacific behind him, he had nothing to show for it. Zero innovations that had saved lives. His battalion had just lost 11 machine gunners in 4 weeks of training. The problem was simple math and cold, hard weight. The American M1919A6 light machine gun weighed 32 pounds and fired 400 rounds per minute. The German MG42 spat out 1,200. On Bougainville, Grevich had watched 3 gunners die because their fire was too slow, too weak to pin the enemy down. They were advanced targets, not suppressors. Now, assigned to the 28th Marines preparing for Iwo Jima, he faced a nightmare scenario, landing on black volcanic sand with nowhere to hide against 21,000 Japanese dug into tunnels. The standard-issue weapon was a death sentence. His company commander listened to his grim assessment and asked the critical question, "Do you have a solution?" Grevich did. He remembered a salvaged aircraft machine gun from Bougainville, modified in the field. It was a fleeting glimpse of what could be. "We can build a better gun," he said. The officer gave a silent, cautious nod. The project was approved. But it was a nod that launched a mission into a shadow world where every step would be unofficial, every part stolen, and success meant defying the entire Marine Corps supply system. Grevich's solution was the AN/M2 aircraft machine gun, a weapon designed for the freezing skies, not the scorching earth. He'd seen it work once. A private on Bougainville had crudely strapped a bipod to one. It fired .30 caliber rounds at a blistering 1,200 rounds per minute, 3 times faster than the M1919. But it had no proper stock, no real trigger, and its barrel, cooled by 300-mile-per-hour airflow in the air, would overheat in seconds on the ground. Grevich and a lieutenant had once tried to build one properly, adding a rifle stock and a trigger. It worked, but their unit was disbanded and the prototype was abandoned. Now, staring at the scrap in Hawaii, that memory burned. He needed that gun. But not 1, 6. 1 for each platoon in his company. He had less than 3 months before the invasion. The command gave him authorization, but no paperwork, no requisitions, no official support. He was on his own. He found his only ally, Private First Class John Little, a quiet machinist who understood metal and tolerances. Together, in the dim light of a maintenance shed, they faced an impossible task: build 6 secret hybrid weapons from scrap, or watch more men fall on Iwo Jima. Their project was born not from orders, but from necessity, and its first lesson was clear. Invention begins where the rulebook ends. Authorization was a phantom currency. It granted permission, but provided no resources. Grevich and Little now entered the shadow economy of the Pacific War. Their shopping list was specific and impossible. 6 AN-M2 aircraft machine gun receivers, M1 Garand stocks, BAR bipods, tools, and trigger parts, all without a single requisition form. The receivers were the heart of the weapon, each a serialized item strictly accounted for by the Navy's ordnance. But the Pacific was a graveyard of machines. Thousands of aircraft had been lost, crashed, shot down, or simply worn out. Their parts lay scattered across salvage yards, in forgotten corners of maintenance depots, or were destined for smelters. The 2 Marines became nocturnal scavengers. By day, they performed their regular duties. By night, they visited warehouses and airfields, asking cautious questions, trading favors, and looking the other way. They found 3 receivers in a parts bin marked for scrap, 2 more in a gutted Dauntless dive bomber fuselage. The 6th came from what Little would only later describe as a guy who knows a guy. It was a world of whispers and handshake deals, where the line between initiative and theft blurred into irrelevance. Every component was a risk, and with each acquired piece, the stakes grew. They were not just building a gun, they were constructing a case for their own court-martial if discovered. Their makeshift workshop was a corner of the battalion maintenance shed, claimed after dark. The first night, November 21st, they laid out their loot under a single dangling light bulb. The AN-M2, stripped of its spade grips, was a cold mechanical puzzle, all function and no form, never meant for a human shoulder. John Little's hands, more accustomed to precision gauges, now worked with brute force and ingenuity. The first task was the trigger. The aircraft gun fired via an electrical solenoid. Little, using sheet metal and a drill, fashioned a crude mechanical trigger that would trip the circuit. It was ugly but functional. The stock was a greater challenge. He took a Garand stock and began carving, hollowing it out to fit the gun's buffer tube, his chisel sending up curls of walnut. Sweat mixed with sawdust. The fit had to be perfect. Too loose and the stock would shatter under recoil. Too tight and it wouldn't seat. For 6 hours, the only sounds were filing, sanding, and muttered curses. Finally, the wood slid on with a satisfying, snug fit. The BAR bipod was next, welded to a custom adapter plate on the barrel shroud. The rear sight, scavenged from a heavy machine gun, was mounted on top. The final touch was a handmade 100-round ammunition box from sheet metal, allowing one man to carry and feed the beast. By December 5th, the first prototype was complete. In a remote corner of the firing range, Grevich loaded a belt, shouldered the unfamiliar weapon, and pulled the homemade trigger. The sound was not the familiar thud, thud, thud of the M1919, but a searing, high-pitched reap, 1,200 rounds per minute tearing the air. For 10 glorious seconds, it was perfection. Then the smell of superheated metal filled his nostrils. After 75 rounds, the barrel, glowing dull red, seized. The miracle gun had a fatal flaw. On the ground, with no 300-mile-per-hour wind to cool it, it was a self-destructing weapon. Their dream gun worked, but it was fundamentally broken. The solution wasn't in more modifications, it was in doctrine. They would have to train men to fire in impossibly short, disciplined bursts, a controlled fury, or nothing at all. The failure on the range was a cold dose of reality. Their weapon wasn't broken, it was misunderstood. It was a sprinter, not a marathon runner. Grevich and Little examined the smoking barrel, its thin steel too fragile for sustained fire. Water cooling was out of the question, too heavy, too complex. The only solution was to change the very doctrine of machine gun use. They devised a brutal, simple rule: bursts of 5, maybe 10 rounds maximum, followed by a mandatory 15-second pause to let the barrel cool. It demanded superhuman discipline from a gunner in the heat of combat, where the instinct is to pour fire onto the enemy, but it was the only way. They named the weapon for the first time, calling it the Stinger for its vicious, rapid-fire bite. Over the next 5 weeks, their clandestine workshop hummed with activity. 5 more receivers were transformed. Each weapon received the same treatment. The spade grips amputated, the crude trigger and Garand stock fitted, the BAR bipod attached, the modified sight mounted. By January 5, 1945, all 6 Stingers were lined up, painted olive drab, their receivers stenciled with white names chosen by Grevich: Betty Ann, Loretta, June Bride. They were crude, hybrid creatures, part rifle, part aircraft gun, wholly unauthorized. Their total weight was just 25 pounds, a full 7 pounds lighter than the M1919A6, yet they promised triple the firepower. As they were packed into unmarked crates for shipment, Grevich felt a surge of pride and dread. They had built a solution no one asked for, and soon, on a distant black beach, they would find out if their theory of controlled fury would hold under the storm of real war. Training the designated gunners was a rushed, secret affair in the final days before embarkation. Grevich gathered the small team, emphasizing the Stinger's power and its fatal weakness. "It's not a hose, it's a scalpel," he drilled into them. "You fire for more than 2 seconds, you kill the gun. You hesitate, you die. Count your shots in your head." The men hefted the strange weapons, feeling the odd balance, the Garand stock against their cheek. They practiced the rhythm, a sharp, ear-splitting reap, then silence, counting while scanning for the next target. It felt unnatural, counter to all their training. Meanwhile, John Little performed a final, meticulous inspection. He checked each weld on the bipod adapters, each fitting of the stock, the alignment of every homemade trigger. He knew these were not factory-made weapons. They were held together by ingenuity and hope. Any one of those custom parts could fail catastrophically at the first serious engagement. On January 7th, the 5th Marine Division boarded its transports. The 6 crates, with no official paperwork, were lost among the thousands of tons of legitimate gear. As the convoy slipped away from Hawaii, Grevich stood on deck watching the islands fade. He carried the standard technical manual for the AN-M2 in his pack, a thin shield against questioning. They had successfully built and smuggled their secret arsenal. The next test was not against paper targets, but against an entire entrenched army. The Stingers were born in shadow, and now they sailed into the heart of the fire.
The journey west was a torturous countdown. In the fetid holds of the transport ships, Grevich and Little performed clandestine maintenance on the Stingers, hidden among legitimate gear. The convoy stopped at Eniwetok Atoll on February 5th for final equipment checks. Under the blazing sun, Grevich test-fired each weapon at a makeshift range, the distinctive ripping sound drawing curious glances. All 6 functioned, but the overheating issue was a constant specter. Days later, during a full dress rehearsal landing on Tinian, the Stingers faced a new enemy, the elements. The weapons survived the chaotic amphibious assault, but saltwater spray corroded the handmade ammunition boxes, and volcanic sand jammed the feed mechanisms. For 48 frantic hours, the 2 men disassembled, cleaned, and waterproofed their creations, wrapping them in canvas tarps. This was no longer an experiment. It was a race against degradation. On February 16th, the island appeared on the horizon, Iwo Jima, 8 square miles of bleak volcanic rock dominated by the brooding hulk of Mount Suribachi. For 74 days, bombers and battleships had hammered it. Yet as the Marines studied the reconnaissance photos, the grim truth settled in. The labyrinth of concrete pillboxes and interconnected tunnels was largely intact. The 28th Marines' objective was Green Beach at the base of Suribachi. They were to cut the mountain off from the rest of the island. The terrain was a defender's dream, black sand that swallowed men and absorbed shells, steep terraces channeling attackers into kill zones. The Stingers, designed for this moment of mobile, overwhelming fire, now seemed terrifyingly fragile. On February 18th, Grevich distributed the weapons to his selected gunners, drilling the lethal mantra into them once more. Short bursts, count, let it cool. 1 Stinger went to each rifle platoon of G Company, 1 to the demolition section. Grevich would carry Betty Ann. The 6th weapon presented a dilemma. It needed a gunner who understood its delicate nature. The battalion commander suggested Corporal Tony Stein from A Company, a toolmaker and machinist from Dayton, Ohio. Stein examined the Stinger with a professional's eye, asking pointed questions about tolerances and weld stress. He understood it instantly. The handoff was made without ceremony. The weapon now had its most aggressive apostle. On February 19th, at 0400 hours, the naval bombardment began, a deafening orchestra of destruction that turned the island into an inferno of smoke and flame. Grevich, packed into a swaying landing craft with 42 men from G Company, felt the weight of Betty Ann and her 100-round box, 47 pounds of hope and insubordination. As his wave approached Green Beach at 0915, an eerie silence fell. The 1st Marines ashore met no resistance. It was a trap. Just as Grevich's boot hit the waist-deep ashy water, the sky fell. Mortars, artillery, and interlocking machine gun fire erupted from hidden positions, turning the black sand into a slaughterhouse. He scrambled to the beach, deployed the bipod, and saw a nearby M1919 team cut down in seconds. He shouldered Betty Ann, found a target, and pulled the crude trigger. The Stinger's scream cut through the hellish noise. The experiment was over. The battle had begun.
The Stinger's first seconds of combat were a terrifying revelation. As Grevich's 10-round burst struck the Japanese pillbox, the effect was immediate. The sheer volume of fire, concentrated into less than a second, hammered the firing port, silencing the gun within. He shifted, fired again, and another position went quiet. Across the bloody chaos of Green Beach, the other Stingers erupted with their distinctive ripping snarl, a sound wholly alien amidst the thump of mortars and the slower chatter of M1919s. The tactical advantage was profound. A standard machine gun team, burdened with weight and the need for setup, was a vulnerable target. The Stinger gunner, operating alone with his 100-round box, could move, drop, and deliver a devastating cone of suppression in moments. They began carving fragile gaps in the Japanese kill zones. But with every burst, the weapons inched toward failure. Grevich could feel Betty Ann's barrel heat radiating through the air. He strictly adhered to his own doctrine: fire, count to 15 under fire, scan, fire again. It was a nerve-shredding discipline. Around him, he saw a Marine struggling with an M1919, the heavier gun's mechanism choked with black sand. The Stinger's enclosed feed box, for now, was proving its worth. On the right flank, Corporal Tony Stein became a force of nature. Armed with his Stinger, he conducted a one-man war. He would advance on a pillbox, silence it with a furious burst, then rush forward with grenades. Realizing his ammunition was vanishing, he began sprinting back to the beach through a gauntlet of fire, not for cover, but for more belts. On his first return trip, he dragged a wounded Marine with him. He did this 8 times. With each trip, the legend of the wild-eyed Marine with the howling, unfamiliar gun grew. By midday, a strange report filtered through the lines. Japanese defenders were heard shouting in confusion during engagements with the Stingers. The weapon's sound and unprecedented rate of fire were breaking their tactical expectations. By 1600 hours, the 28th Marines had achieved their D-Day objective, cutting off Mount Suribachi, but at a horrific cost. As the fighting subsided to sporadic cracks of rifle fire, Grevich inspected Betty Ann. The barrel was a lost cause, heat discolored and with the first hairline cracks. Little examined the other weapons that evening. His prognosis was grim. The aircraft-grade barrels, subjected to ground combat heat, were failing. They had maybe 48 hours of operational life left. The Stingers had won their first day, but they were dying from the inside out, and there were no spare parts in hell. February 20th dawned with a cold, drizzling rain that did nothing to quench the island's simmering heat. The 28th Marines began their assault on Mount Suribachi, a 550-foot volcano of rock, caves, and hidden death. The Stingers were immediately put to the test. Advancing uphill across open ground, Marines were funneled into corridors raked by interlocking fire. Grevich, with Betty Ann, worked in a lethal rhythm. Identify a muzzle flash, a 10-round suppressing burst, a 15-second count under fire as riflemen scrambled forward a few precious yards, then repeat. The system worked, but it was a desperate race against physics. By 0900, the first Stinger fell. The gunner from the first platoon, perhaps rushing, fired a burst too long. A sharp crack echoed, not the weapon firing, but its thin barrel splitting under heat stress. The gun was dead. Another Stinger jammed irrevocably minutes later, volcanic dust grinding its handmade feed mechanism into a solid mass of grit and brass. A third succumbed to catastrophic overheating, its barrel warping until rounds tumbled uselessly. In less than 2 hours, half of their secret arsenal was gone. The advance slowed to a bloody crawl as squads, deprived of their primary suppressing fire, were pinned down. Grevich, Stein, and the 2nd platoon gunner now carried the entire regiment's rapid-fire hope on their shoulders. The weight was more than physical. The remaining Stingers fought on, but they were living on borrowed time. Ammunition became a critical issue. Supply lines were broken, and bearers were cut down by mortar fire. Grevich, down to his last 75-round belt, reduced his bursts to a mere 3 rounds, choosing only the most immediate threats. At 10:45, the 2nd platoon Stinger suffered a mechanical heart attack. The sheet metal trigger assembly, forged from scrap and stressed by hundreds of cycles, finally snapped. The gunner tried in vain to activate the firing solenoid by hand, but the weapon was finished. Now only 2 were left, Betty Ann and Stein's gun. Separated on opposite slopes of the mountain, they couldn't support each other. Each was an isolated, dying asset. By late afternoon, as the Marines dug in halfway up Suribachi, Grevich conducted a grim assessment. Betty Ann's barrel was visibly warped, the receiver showing fine stress cracks. He estimated 50 rounds of life remained. The weapon that promised a revolution was now a liability, soon to become 25 pounds of dead weight. The Stingers had done their job, creating breakthroughs where standard guns failed, but their brilliance was as fleeting as a muzzle flash. They were not the future. They were a stopgap, burning out in a violent, short-lived spectacle to buy inches on a mountain of sacrifice.
Betty Ann fired her last rounds on February 21st. A final, precise burst silenced a Japanese nest, and then the firing solenoid failed, severed by heat and vibration. Grevich set the weapon aside, a piece of scrap metal again, and picked up a rifle. Tony Stein's Stinger lasted 2 days longer, its barrel finally fracturing on the 24th. By February 26th, all 6 were dead, 4 with burst barrels, 1 with a broken trigger, 1 with a cracked receiver. They were collected, but as unauthorized ghosts they never entered an official inventory. Their likely fate was a burial in the island's volcanic ash or a disposal pit with other shattered gear. Their war lasted less than a week. Stein, now fighting with a standard M1919, continued his relentless bravery. On March 1st, leading a patrol against a machine gun complex north of Hill 362A, he was killed instantly by a sniper's bullet. He was 23 years old. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor began its journey up the chain of command that same month. The citation, detailing his extraordinary valor on D-Day, described his weapon as a personally improvised aircraft-type machine gun. This phrase, personally improvised, was technically true for Stein, but historically incomplete. It created a powerful simplifying narrative, a heroic toolmaker from Dayton who single-handedly built a wonder weapon. The messy, collaborative truth of the 2 sergeants in Hawaii was erased by bureaucratic shorthand. The medal was approved at every level, all the way to President Truman. On February 19, 1946, the first anniversary of the landing, Tony Stein's widow received the Medal of Honor in Ohio. Newspapers across America carried the story of his solo heroism and his improvised gun. Meanwhile, Mel Grevich and John Little, the actual creators, were already fading into obscurity. Both had survived the brutal 36-day battle. Grevich returned to Minnesota, lived a quiet life, and never publicly spoke of the Stingers. Little became a home builder in California, his role known only to a few comrades. The Marine Corps, after evaluating the Stinger's performance, rejected it for wider adoption. The core flaw, the aircraft barrel's inability to withstand sustained ground combat, was deemed a logistical nightmare. The weapon was forgotten,
and with it the names of its builders. History cemented the link. Stein was the stinger. It took decades for meticulous historians, piecing together after-action reports and veteran interviews, to rediscover Grevich and Little's crucial roles. The Medal of Honor citation, intended to enshrine glory, had inadvertently buried a key part of the story. The price of Stein's immortal glory was the oblivion of the two men whose ingenuity made his defining act possible. Their reward was to survive and to be forgotten.
For decades, the story of the Stinger existed only in fragments, a footnote in unit diaries, a curious tale told by aging veterans, overshadowed by the iconic flag-raising and the official narrative of Tony Stein's Medal of Honor. The weapon itself, all 6 originals, was lost to the island's black sands, leaving no physical evidence. The turning point began with meticulous historians cross-referencing after-action reports from the 28th Marines with technical manuals and oral histories. They found discrepancies. The phrase "personally improvised" in Stein's citation clashed with veterans' accounts mentioning sergeants in Hawaii and the machinist from A Company. Interviews with surviving members of the 5th Division, conducted in the 1980s and 1990s, slowly drew Mel Grevich and John Little out of the shadows. Their detailed recollections of the scavenging, the nights in the maintenance shed, the specific modifications carried the ring of undeniable truth. The historical record was being corrected not by a single document, but by the accumulated weight of shared memory. The story was no longer just about a heroic moment. It was about months of clandestine labor, institutional subversion, and a partnership that created a tool for survival. Grevich and Little, once anonymous, were finally being credited as the inventors. Their legacy, however, remained bittersweet, a testament to ingenuity recognized only after most who were there had gone. The ultimate validation came not from archives, but from reconstruction. In the early 2000s, a team from a historical arms museum, using only the descriptions from veterans and period-correct tools, attempted to build a Stinger. It took them 3 months, the same amount of time Grevich and Little had with 6 guns. They confirmed every detail: the devastating rate of fire, the manageable recoil with the Garand stock, and crucially, the catastrophic overheating after sustained fire. The experiment proved the Stinger was both a brilliant innovation and a profound compromise. It was never the perfect weapon, but it was the right weapon for a specific, desperate moment on a hellish beach. Today, the replica stands as the only physical representative of their achievement. The story of the Stinger is now more complete, a cautionary tale about how history is written and a tribute to the quiet architects of victory. It reminds us that behind a single act of valor often stands the unseen labor of many. Mel Grevich and John Little did not seek glory, they sought a solution. In the end, they found both, even if it took history half a century to catch up. Their shadow has finally found its place in the light.